Okay, welcome back from lunch. It's my great pleasure now to introduce the chair of the next panel, Lord Wilson, Richard Wilson, who of course needs no introduction here in Cambridge, an alumnus of Clare College, a recent master of Emmanuel College, and somehow in between he managed to become Cabinet Secretary. But I'm going to hand over to Richard, who's going to introduce his panel and the topic for discussion now.
Thank you, Alan, very much for that. A great pleasure to chair this hugely distinguished panel. You can find biographies of them in the programme, which we've got. But just to say, we've got John Gummer, who will speak first. I'm going to take it in the order in the programme to avoid any questions. John Gummer, who was a very distinguished Secretary of State for the Environment. I think it's everyone should be reminded of that, where I was his permanent secretary for a year. David Trimble, who is a very distinguished First Minister in Northern Ireland from 1998 to 2002, which are the years when I was Cabinet Secretary, and we were from time to time thrown together. Is it true? And Bruce Kent, who is also very distinguished, but I have never met before today. So it's a very, very fine team. We have 90 minutes for the session. When I finish speaking, which will be in about 4 or 5 minutes, I'm going to invite each of the speakers to speak in the order in the paper, and I hope they will speak for about 15 minutes. If I think it's going on too long, I shan't say anything, but I shall pick up a bottle of water and pass it to them. only if I think only as a gentle hint, because I think they may need refreshment. I have no idea where this session is going. It could go in all sorts of directions. I shall try to concentrate on steering and keeping good order. It could go in the direction of relations between religions and successive governments. And I see that Baroness Owasi, who's speaking later, has already told, I think it's the Telegraph, what she is going to be saying about faith being back at the heart of government, like it was in the days of Churchill and Thatcher. I have a memory of, I was secretary of Mrs. Thatcher's Inner Cities Committee in 1987, when she had said on the steps of the celebratory Conservative headquarters, on Monday we must do something about the inner cities. And as secretary of the committee, I gave members of the committee a number of documents to read as background papers, including Faith in the Cities, which had been published, I think, in 1985. And I have an abiding memory of her at the meeting saying, well, going through the meeting, and then she said, oh, and we've got this. And she handed it to me. And there was a kind of non-verbal message there, which I very clearly... I also, though, have a memory of an occasion when we were discussing homelessness. And there'd been a discussion and all the options had been dismissed and there was a pause as to what do we do now. And then she looked at everyone and she said, I wonder what Mother Teresa would say. So I think religion is quite often in the minds of politicians, and we will hear from them later, is certainly in the governments I've worked for, has both got it should know its place. It's important, but it should know its place. And of course, so that's the first area. Secondly, there's the area of relations between the government and, rather, the church and the state, which I was both a permanent secretary of the Home Office and a secretary of the Cabinet. I spent a great deal of time on at various points. We had some very interesting contributions this morning about it. I would just emphasise to you that the legislative position of the Church of England is incredibly complicated. It's a kind of brilliant Chinese box contained in the Act of Settlement 1701 and the Act of Union 1707, in which religion is inextricably tied up with the roots of the Union and with the position of the monarch. And to try to undo it requires brains of a supreme order. just to give you one example, the legislation requires the new monarch, the morning or the day after accession, to swear an oath of accession in which they promise to defend the Church of Scotland. And then they also have to swear an oath on the opening of the state opening of Parliament, of the first Parliament, about their own personal religion and swear that they are Protestant. And anyone who wanted to legislate to change that would not be able to do it because Parliament would only meet after the oaths have been sworn, would not be able to do it without requiring the monarch signing the legislation to break the oath which they have sworn. If you read the legislation, the entrenchment of the Church of England in the British Constitution is more clever and more complicated than I think commentators usually give it credit to. So are we going to get into the constitutional area? Because when Prince of Wales talks about being defender of faith rather than the faith, rather than the faith, it gets you straight into that kind of constitutional difficulty. Are we going to hear about the personal impact of religion on the lives of members of government? It was something through my 10 years as Permanent Secretary and Cabinet Secretary, which I was very conscious of. Of the 3 leading politicians I worked for, 2/3 of them were in transition from the Church of England to the Roman Catholic Church, by which I mean John Gummer and Tony Blair. Michael Howard held out. He delegated to me the responsibility for dealing with the Church of England when he was Home Secretary. I attended a synod, which I think left me older, if not wiser, which forgive me. I also worked with Anne Widdecombe, which again, she also was in transition. And I worked with Tony Blair when he was, although he wasn't publicly allowed to, by Alistair Campbell, to show much interest in faith, was privately deeply interested in religion. I will always remember after 9/11 seeing on the table of his desk, on the table in his study, the Quran absolutely festooned with post-its. And I don't know what the pages were, but it was a signal of his interest. Are we going to talk about that, or are we going to talk about the divisions, religious problems which beset successive governments, in particular in Northern Ireland, which for much of my career was important, and also the growth of Islam, where in the early 70s we noted in the Cabinet Office the importance of Islam, growing the importance of Islamic states around the world, and we analysed it and thought it would only be significant in terms of trade, another example of the many things that one can get wrong when you don't know the future. Or are we going to talk about the other organisations with a religious flavour which had an impact on government, such as CND, which when I joined the civil service was regarded with deep suspicion, I think, when I was subject, as people of my generation were, to something called positive vetting, in which every crevice of your private life was investigated to ensure that you weren't going to be a vulnerability to the Soviet Union. And one of the more penetrating parts of the cross-examination you had to undergo was whether you had ever had any connection with CND. So that, and of course it was led by Canon Collins at that time, who was the Dean of St. Paul's. So there was a kind of, the impact of those sort of bodies on government are also important. There are so many ways we can go. I've talked for enough. I'm now going to invite our speakers to speak, beginning with Lord Debon, otherwise known as John Selwyn Gummer.